Under the vaulted ceiling of the Philadelphia Civic Arena, history wasn't just waiting, it was trembling. More than 4,000 people packed the seats, not just to watch a debate, but to witness a reckoning. Cameras from 12 major news networks blinked like mechanical eyes, fixed on a stage dressed in steel and velvet. The backdrop read, Civil Rights Policy Summit. But the energy in the room whispered something different. This wasn't a panel. This was a battleground. Two podiums stood center, stage simple, unassuming, yet burning with anticipation. One belonged to Jasmine Crockett, a congresswoman shaped by courtrooms, protest lines, and the quiet kind of courage that doesn't need applause. The other? Candace Owens, a figure of fire and friction, known for turning controversy into currency, for saying what others were afraid to say, and sometimes what they wished she wouldn't. The summit had titled this panel, The Great Divide. And that title? It wasn't exaggeration, it was prophecy. Backstage, crew members moved like monks preparing for a sacred ritual. Technicians adjusted lights. Security scanned the crowd with calm precision. Somewhere behind the curtain, a producer leaned toward a colleague and whispered, "If this blows up tonight, it's not just headlines, it's history." And he was right. Because tonight wasn't just about politics. It was about culture, about identity, about which version of truth America was finally ready to believe. The crowd reflected that tension. Students with notepads, elders with church hats, influencers live streaming, journalists already drafting their first paragraph. Some came to cheer. Some came to challenge. All came for something real. Then the lights dimmed. A hush fell across the room so thick it could muffle a heartbeat. And when the first spotlight hit the stage, revealing Jasmine Crockett in a charcoal suit, heels striking the floor with measured grace, half the room erupted in cheers. The other half froze, silent, waiting. Seconds later, Candace Owens emerged, confidence radiating like armor. The applause she received was sharp, proud, defiant. Their eyes met. No handshake, no smile. This wasn't going to be a conversation. This was going to be a collision. And America? America was watching. Candace Owens didn't waste a second. As soon as the applause faded, she stepped forward unshaken, unhurried, and completely composed. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. It was sharpened like a bladed deliberate, rehearsed, and cold. Black Lives Matter isn't a movement, she began. It's a business, a cash machine powered by guilt and tragedy. The words didn't just land. They detonated. A ripple ran through the crowd. Some gasped. Some clapped. Others exchanged nervous glances, unsure if they had just heard what they thought they did. But Candace didn't flinch. She wasn't here to ease anyone's conscience. She was here to challenge the narrative. And then, without warning, she turned to Jasmine Crockett. Her eyes narrowed not in anger, but in precision, like she was delivering a closing argument in a courtroom she believed she already owned. "And you," she said, each syllable slicing through the stillness, "are their perfect weapon. You wear the robe of a lawyer, the badge of a lawmaker. But all you do is dress up resentment in legal language. You're not fighting for justice. You're selling victimhood, with polish, with poise, with just enough Ivy League shine to make it palatable." The room reacted instantly. One side erupted in applause and agreement. Others just stirred by the drama. The other half? Silent. Not because they didn't feel something, but because they did. And they didn't know what to do with it. This wasn't just a debate tactic. This was a line drawn in public view between two women, yes, but also between two visions of what it means to fight for a community. Candace didn't stop there. You say you're the voice of the unheard, but you're just an echo of grievance, repeated in courtrooms and campaign speeches. You're not lifting us. You're keeping us anchored in the past. The crowd fractured, some muttering, some applauding, some frozen. The moderator shifted in his seat. The camera lights flickered as crew zoomed in on Jasmine's face. But Jasmine? She didn't blink. She didn't flinch. She didn't even raise an eyebrow. Because she'd heard this before, not just from opponents, but from inside boardrooms, from panels where she was the only black woman at the table, from professors who praised her brilliance but questioned her tone. Candace may have thought she landed the first blow, but Jasmine wasn't here to react. She was here to reveal. And as the silence thickened around her, she did exactly what the moment demanded. She stood still. Because sometimes, stillness is strategy. And silence? That's just the inhale before the truth hits back. For a moment, you could have heard a pin drop. Candace Owens had thrown the match, and the room was starting to smoke. Some in the crowd leaned forward, waiting for a verbal brawl. Others sat back, expecting a defensive swing. But Jasmine Crockett didn't give them either. She didn't blink. She didn't twitch. She didn't even shift her weight. She just stood there. And that stillness? It spoke louder than anything she could have said in that second. Because Jasmine had been here before, not on a stage this grand, but in rooms where the judgment was silent, polite, and every bit as sharp. She'd heard that tone from law professors who praised her briefs but questioned her passion. From interviewers who asked her if she could tone it down to fit the culture. From committee chairs who nodded at her credentials but rolled their eyes when she stood firm. Candace's words weren't new. They were just louder. But Jasmine wasn't moved. Not because they didn't cut, but because she'd already learned how to stand while bleeding. And then, quietly, powerfully, she stepped forward. Her voice didn't thunder. It didn't need to. It was steady, measured, and soaked in memory. "You want to talk about tools?" she said, her tone calm but sharp. "You're using the same script they used on my grandmother. Same phrases, same venom, just wrapped in better lighting." There it was. A line so honest it didn't slap, it sank. And she wasn't done. "You're not speaking hard truths," she continued. "You're repackaging the same language that's always been used to keep people in their place. The only difference? This time, it's coming from someone who looks like us." The crowd shifted. Some gasped. Some whispered. Some simply nodded slow, deliberate, the way people do when they've waited years to hear someone say exactly what needed to be said. Jasmine paused, not to gather herself, but to let the silence breathe, to make sure everyone felt it. Then she delivered the line that landed like a verdict. "You're not challenging the system. You're recycling its script." And just like that, the stage didn't feel balanced anymore. Candace had the volume. Jasmine had the weight. Because sometimes, leadership isn't about being the first to speak. It's about knowing when to speak and what not to say until the moment is right. And Jasmine Crockett? She had waited her whole life for this moment. Not to destroy anyone, but to defend everything that mattered. Candace Owens didn't flinch. She let Jasmine's words linger for a second, then stepped back up to the mic, calm, poised, ready to reframe the battlefield. But this time, she didn't come with metaphors or moral judgments. She came with numbers. 75%, she said flatly. That's the number of black children born out of wedlock in this country. A few murmurs broke out. She didn't pause. Black-on-black crime rates are higher than ever. Communities torn apart. Schools underperforming. Violence replacing opportunity. Her voice didn't tremble. It sliced. To some, it sounded like honesty. To others, like accusation. But to Jasmine, it was something far more familiar. Weaponized data. Because Candace didn't deliver those numbers to educate. She used them to convict. "And what do the so-called civil rights leaders do?" Candace continued. "They tell people to protest, to blame, to demand handouts. They use skin color as a shield, while ignoring the need for standards." The reaction was immediate. Some stood and clapped. Others groaned and sat back in disbelief. A few just folded their arms, trying to process what they were hearing. This wasn't a conversation anymore. It was a cross-examination, and the whole community was on trial. The moderator looked uneasy, gripping his note cards like they might catch fire. Cameras zoomed in, waiting for the next explosion. But Jasmine? She didn't explode. She stepped forward with the same calm that had carried her through courtrooms, crisis meetings, and communities crying out for answers. And then she said something no statistic could touch. "Numbers don't reveal truth," she said quietly. They reveal symptoms. A pause. A heartbeat. They don't explain how we got here. They don't tell you about red-line neighborhoods, or schools crumbling from neglect, or the job opportunities that were never offered because of a name on a resume. She didn't shout, but the room leaned in. You use those numbers like shackles, she continued, eyes locked on Candace, voice like tempered steel. Not to expose injustice, but to silence the people who've lived through it. Now the crowd didn't move. They listened, not because she raised her voice, but because they finally felt seen. Pain doesn't mean pathology, she said, and survival isn't shameful. It's sacred. It wasn't just a rebuttal. It was a recalibration of the entire conversation. Candace had delivered data, but Jasmine delivered something heavier. Context, history, humanity. Because numbers can be spun. But lived experience? That's not up for debate. Just when the crowd thought they'd seen the peak win, the tension felt almost manageable. A flicker on the giant screen to the right of the stage hijacked the air. The moderator paused mid-sentence. Producers scrambled behind the scenes. And then, without warning, it happened. A video feed lit up across every screen in the arena. No warning, no context. There, in grainy lighting and raw footage, stood Candace Owens at a podium, speaking to a youth summit in Europe. The year, 2018. Her voice came through clearly, unmistakably calm. If Hitler just wanted to make Germany great and have things run well, okay, fine. The rest of the sentence blurred under the weight of collective shock. The words weren't shouted. They weren't fumbled. They were stated with eerie composure, as if part of a long-winded theory on history and nationalism. But in this room, this night amid a summit on civil rights and racial justice, they didn't land like nuance. They hit like betrayal. A wave of gasps rippled through the crowd. Someone in the third row jumped to their feet and yelled, "She said what?" A chorus of whispers turned to murmurs, then into audible outrage. People weren't reacting to an opinion. They were reacting to a fracturea, sudden rupture between public persona and past rhetoric. Candace stood frozen, still at her podium, staring at the screen, at herself. For a moment, her signature confidence flickered, not gone, but cracked. Her hands, once gripping the lectern with control, now hovered slightly, uncertain of where to land. Her expression, part disbelief, part dread. Because this wasn't a political opponent's attack. This was her own words, her own tone, her own face. And the silence that followed? It wasn't peaceful. It was stunned, heavy, like a courtroom the moment before a verdict is read. The journalists in the front row typed furiously. Flashes burst from cameras like lightning, trying to catch every angle of this unexpected storm. The crowd didn't need Jasmine to say anything. She didn't even turn toward Candace. She stood still, not triumphant, not smug, just steady. Because truth doesn't always need a speaker. Sometimes it just needs a screen and a rewind button. And in that moment, Candace Owens wasn't facing off against a rival. She was facing off against herself. The room was still vibrating from the shock of the video. The kind of collective discomfort that settles deep not because of what was said, but because of who said it. Candace Owens stood at her podium, eyes fixed on the screen, her jaw locked tight. The footage had ended. The sound was off, but the echo, it was deafening. Across the stage, Jasmine Crockett didn't move. She didn't look at Candace. She didn't adjust her mic. She didn't even raise an eyebrow. And that silence? It was devastating. Because everyone in that arena already knew there was nothing more Jasmine needed to say. She could have attacked. She could have delivered the knockout punch. But she didn't. She chose stillness. Not a strategy, but as a statement. A statement that said, "The truth just stood up. I don't need to push it forward. It already walked in on its own." Candace tried to recover. Her voice, once ironclad, now sounded tight, rushed. "That clip," she snapped, "was edited, taken out of context. I was discussing sovereignty, not endorsing evil." But the words didn't land. Not because the crowd wasn't listening, but because they were. And what they heard was not redemption, it was retreat. Because once a mask slips, there's no putting it back on. Not in the age of screenshots and shared truths. The audience didn't boo. They didn't cheer. They just stared. It was the kind of silence you don't earn with applause. It's the kind that comes when a verdict has already been delivered. And Jasmine? She leaned in, slowly, deliberately. "You say I divide our people?" she said, voice low, almost gentle. "But what exactly are you doing with history?" She paused, not to think, but to let the words find their target. "You're rehearsing the most dangerous play ever written." The sentence didn't explode. It settled, like ash falling after a fire no one saw coming. Even the camera operators hesitated to move. The air felt thick like truth had changed the oxygen in the room. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to, because in that moment, she wasn't defending herself. She was speaking for every forgotten voice that had ever been drowned out by someone louder, slicker, and more dangerous with a microphone. Candace may have sparked controversy, but Jasmine? She sparked clarity. And clarity real, undeniable clarity doesn't shout. It stands. The debate officially ended with applause, but no one left their seat because everyone knew the real aftermath had just begun. The story didn't stay in that arena. It detonated. Within minutes, newsrooms across the country lit up. Clips from the summit flooded social media. Jasmine Crockett's calm rebuttal. Candace Owens' historical quote. The frozen frame of her watching her own past play out in public. One headline read, "Candace Owens, Implodes Live Civil Rights Summit Becomes Reckoning." Another, more biting. "You spread poison and called it freedom." Jasmine Crockett breaks the internet. But the most viral moment wasn't from the debate stage at all. It was a low-resolution clip dug up by an old community activist in Dallas. A short video of Jasmine Crockett standing outside a courthouse years ago, before any national spotlight had touched her name. No makeup, no podium, just her voice and a file of legal documents. She stood next to a 14-year-old black boy, wrongfully accused of stealing his own bicycle and tackled by police. The boy trembled beside her. She stood between him and the flashing cameras like a shield. "Justice doesn't wait for headlines," she said. "It waits for someone who's no longer afraid to lose everything." That line? It was everywhere. TikTok, Twitter, Instagram. It was reposted by veterans, teachers, Civil Rights Group 7, a celebrity chef. People weren't just reacting to a scandal. They were responding to something they hadn't felt in a long time. Authenticity. And while Jasmine's past went viral for being real, Candace's past went viral for being revealing and not in the way she wanted. A leaked memo surfaced from a major political group she'd been tied to. It revealed she had previously been reprimanded for crossing the line of acceptable commentary regarding extremist ideology. The line in the document was chilling. Any further volatility of this nature will result in contract termination. They had known. They had warned her. Now they were stepping back quietly, but unmistakably. Sponsorships dried up. Podcast episodes disappeared. Her name was removed from upcoming conference schedules without announcement. Her upcoming book release postponed indefinitely. And through it all, Jasmine said nothing. No tweet. No clapback. No press tour. She went back to work, walking into schools, meeting with families, showing up in the places where her name meant less than her presence. Because while Candace had built a brand, Jasmine had built trust. And in the digital age, one clip can destroy a brand. But one truth? That can spark a movement. The contrast was no longer up for debate. By the time the weekend ended, the country had quietly and loudly made its choice. On one side was Candace Owens, polished, practiced, and now painfully exposed. On the other, Jasmine Crockett, grounded, unshaken, and rising not because of performance, but because of presence. It wasn't just about the summit anymore. It was about what people wanted to believe in. A clip of Jasmine from the courthouse, flanked by that trembling teenage boy, was now being shown in classrooms across the country. A teacher in New Jersey told local news, "My students don't trust politics, but they trust her face when she's not trying to sell them anything." Churches played her speech during Sunday service. Law schools added her congressional hearings to their ethics curriculum. Activists stitched her lines into TikTok montages alongside quotes from Fannie Lou Hamer and Angela Davis. The caption? "We don't yell to be heard. We speak to be remembered." Meanwhile, Candace's defenders began to drift into silence, or worse, distance. A conservative podcast host who once praised her weekly now opened his show with hesitation. "I supported her for shaking the table, but it looks like she flipped the whole thing over." One influential donor group released a formal statement calling for Candace to step away from political commentary not because they disagreed with her values, but because her presence had become too costly to credibility. And as that credibility crumbled, Jasmine didn't gloat. She didn't even speak. Her silence became her statement. Because at this point, the story wasn't about Candace's fall. It was about what Jasmine had quietly built beneath everyone's radar. She had never needed a spotlight. She had just needed the noise to die down long enough for the world to hear what she'd been saying all along. And now that they heard it, they weren't letting go. Across social media, a quote from her debate response was being printed on hoodies, murals, and protest signs. "I don't seek power. I'm giving back the voice her half-truths pushed into silence." It wasn't a clapback. It was a mission statement. And as the media tried to catch up analyzing, debating, speculating, the public had already made up its mind. Jasmine Crockett wasn't just a trending topic. She had become a reference point. A reminder that sometimes, in a world full of noise and narrative, what people need most is someone who doesn't raise their voice. They raise the standard. The ballroom lights dimmed, the murmurs hushed, and for a full breath, time itself seemed to pause. It was the final night of the NAACP National Convention held in Detroit. Every seat had been filled hours earlier. The air inside the Grand River Auditorium wasn't just thick with anticipation, it buzzed with something deeper. A question hung over the crowd like electricity before a storm. Would she speak about Candace? Jasmine Crockett hadn't said a word publicly since the debate. No tweets, no interviews, just silence. The kind that doesn't hide, heals. So when she stepped onto that stage, alone, in a black suit with a single gold congressional pin on her lapel, the audience didn't cheer right away. They stood, not out of habit, but out of reverence. Jasmine approached the mic slowly. No music, no intro reel, just the weight of a nation waiting to exhale. She took a breath. "Thank you to the NAACP," she began, her voice clear and low. "Not just for the invitation, but for the timing." A few nods, a few murmurs. Because right now the country is acting shocked. Shocked that cruelty gets rewarded. Shocked that performance is mistaken for principle. Shocked that when truth finally walks in, lies start tripping over their own microphones. Laughter. Snaps. A ripple of applause. But she didn't linger there. She pivoted gracefully, deliberately. "I didn't come here to clap back," she said. "I came here to call forward." Now the room locked in. Thousands leaned forward. Phones lifted. History was being written in real time. "This isn't about two women with different views," she continued. "This is about a country asking itself a hard question. Who do we trust with the mic when the noise finally stops?" And then came the line that would ricochet through headlines and hearts alike. "It's not about who shouts the loudest. Sometimes, being real is loud enough." The audience exploded not with chaos, but with clarity. It wasn't a rally cry. It was a verdict. People weren't cheering a speech. They were recognizing a leader. And Jasmine stood in that stillness, not performing, not posturing, but simply present. She didn't come to finish a feud. She came to start a standard. And by the time she stepped away from the microphone, it was no longer a question of if she would lead next. It was a question of how far her voice could carry in a country that was finally, truly ready to listen. The microphone was still warm when the next invitation came. Not from a podcast, not from a network, but from the Democratic National Convention itself. Jasmine Crockett had been chosen to deliver the keynote address at DNC 2025. There were no leaks, no staged rollouts, just a press release stamped with the party seal and one simple line that sent shockwaves through American media. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett to deliver the DNC keynote in Chicago. And suddenly, All eyes were back on her, not with skepticism, but with expectation. This wasn't symbolic. This was seismic. The woman once told she was too direct for national politics, too emotional for primetime, was now being handed the biggest political microphone in the country. And when she stepped onto that stage, something was different. She didn't look like a rising star. She looked like someone who had already arrived. The arena didn't just cheer, it stood together as if pulled by gravity. Delegates from every corner of America's rural towns, inner cities, college campus held signs that didn't say Crockett 2025 or Madam President. They said, "I vote because of her." She began with no theatrics, just a line that cut straight through the noise. When they invited me here, I asked, "Do you want the safe version of me or the real one?" Laughter, silence, then stillness. They said real. So here I am. She didn't deliver a speech. She delivered a truth. About democracy, about fear, about walking into polling places with your ancestors in your pocket and your dignity on the line. They say young people don't care, she said. But I've seen them cry in courtrooms and rise in protests. What they don't believe in isn't democracy. It's the people who ask them to vote and then ignore what that vote means. It wasn't rhetoric. It was revelation. By the time she finished, the nation wasn't asking if she would run. They were asking, how soon? But Jasmine didn't launch a campaign. She didn't announce a tour. She just kept showing up. In courtrooms, in classrooms, in communities where her voice wasn't a headline, it was a lifeline. And while Candace Owens faded from the spotlight tweeting defensively, then disappearing quietly, Jasmine never said her name again. She didn't need to. Because some people win debates. But others, they define what the debate was really about. And Jasmine Crockett had done exactly that. Not with volume, not with vengeance, but with one truth, spoken clearly enough, that the country couldn't forget it even after the lights went out.